The chain of responsibility pattern solves a somewhat specific problem, but a really commonly occurring problem. You have a multi step request process, and you need these steps to be done in sequence, and you don't want the application to manage the process because the steps actually have, or could, have some approval to them. So each one of the steps may pass on to another step some information, or the steps might short circuit it and return and say, okay, we're all good, or it's all bad. The chain of responsibility pattern is used really commonly for approval processes. For instance, approving a purchase order, or reviewing documents, or human resource approvals for vacation or something like that. They're also used a lot in back office software. Back office software is the operational software as opposed to the consumer customer facing software. And that's the software that deals with human resources and purchasing and manufacturing, the real nuts and bolts of a company. Back office software is also used in really large companies. And of course, one of the major players in that is SAP. So we'll talk a little bit about how that approval works in a back office software. And that approval process can also be known as a workflow in that kind of environment. Chain of responsibility has a really long description in the Gang of Four. You want to avoid coupling the sender of request to its receiver by giving more than one object a chance to handle the request. And we want to chain the receiving objects and pass the request along the chain until an object handles it. Very simply, what this means is the application is going to initiate a request with essentially the first receiver or approval in the chain of command, and then we'll wait for an answer. Each receiver of that request will then pass along the request to the next receiver, or it may stop the chain and return to the application either that accept or deny, or whatever the appropriate response should be. So for our example, let's talk about a back office material approval. SAP has a very long and complex way of approving a new material for a company. There are a lot of things that go into that. For example, you need to make sure that all the part numbers and drawings and procurement sources are established for the material. You also need to make a make or buy decision. In other words, are we going to make this material in the factory, or are we going to buy it as a complete assembly from a vendor? So depending upon the company, this may involve a lot of departments. It may involve an engineering department, a manufacturing department, a finance department, a purchasing department, a lot of areas. And what SAP does is it can take almost 40 approvals to get a material through that system. And there are a lot of other little steps just besides a yes/no answer on those approvals. So it's a really complex process, and it's handled with something called a workflow, which is essentially a chain of responsibility pattern. A workflow basically sends out a request to the first approver, and it can actually send out that first request to more than one if they can work in parallel. And then on the basis of them having completed whatever steps they need to do, the workflow will then be sent to the next one down the chain. And eventually, it will all hopefully meet at the end with a fully approved material. But it's a really complex process, and it lays out in the same way a chain of responsibility pattern would. So for our example, we're going to tighten that up a little bit, and we're going to request a new material be added to our system. And our process for approval won't be quite as lengthy as SAP, and we won't go through quite as many departments as SAP. We'll have an approver abstract class, and this is going to be essentially the central class of the chain of responsibility. In that approver class, we'll have an approve material method, which will return a true or false for the approval, and it'll have a reason parameter if they've returned false. It'll also have a set next approver method, and that will lay out the chain of command. And just by the way, who are those guys? Descending from that approver abstract class, we'll have an engineering approver, and their role will be to look for proper part numbers and drawing numbers. Then we'll have a purchasing approver, and the purchasing approver will be able to approve any material up to a certain budget limit, and they'll be able to disapprove material that's over a certain budget limit. And somewhere in between, they'll need to pass it along to finance. And then we'll have a finance approver, and they can approve a larger budget limit than the purchasing representative. And of course, they'll also disapprove something that's completely absurd. So we'll have our abstract class, and it'll have an internal member called nextApprover, and that will be set when the method setNextApprover is called. Basically, the flow for this from the application's point of view is it will create the various approvers that are necessary, and then it will call setNextApprover on each one of the appropriate approver classes to basically lay out who's first, who's second, who's third along that chain of responsibility. Once that's done, the application will call the ApproveMaterial method on the first approver. In that first approver class, it'll do its work, and if it needs to call the next approver, it'll check to see if that exists by checking that internal member, and if the next approver does exist, it will subsequently call the ApproveMaterial method on that next approver. So we've got the three subclasses down here, and we're going to start off our chain of command with that engineering approver. Assuming that everything was good for part numbers and drawing numbers, the engineering approver is basically saying yes. He'll then look at his next approver member and see that it's the purchasing approver. So he'll call the purchasing approver and call the ApproveMaterial method on the purchasing approver, who will then do their thing, and if they have to, they'll call ApproveMaterial on the finance approver. So that's the way the chain of responsibility works. And essentially what we're just trying to do is to get things to work in sequence and take the burden off of the application in terms of following along all of this various approving sequence, and get that out of the application main code and put the responsibility on the approver classes.